The morning sun cast long shadows across the interstate as Raymond Ray Carter adjusted his weathered hands on the steering wheel of his 18-wheeler. The truck, which he had christened La Milagrosa 30 years ago, hummed steadily beneath, him like a faithful companion that had never let him down. At 63, Ray had spent more of his life in the driver's seat than anywhere else, and that was exactly how he preferred it. The CB radio crackled with the familiar chatter of fellow truckers sharing road conditions, weather updates, and the occasional joke that had been making rounds for decades. Ray listened but rarely participated. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best company a man could have, especially when that man had spent 4 decades running from memories that refused to fade. His logbook showed another routine haul, hydraulic parts from Detroit to somewhere in Georgia. 3 days on the road, decent pay at the end and no complications. Ray had signed the delivery papers at the depot without his usual careful inspection, trusting his instincts more than fine print, as he had done thousands of times before. It wasn't until he was programming his GPS that he noticed the final destination that made his coffee grow cold in his hands: Savannah, Georgia. The name hit him like a physical blow, causing him to pull over at the next rest stop. For 42 years, Ray had meticulously avoided that city, planning routes that took him hundreds of miles out of his way, rather than drive through those familiar streets. Savannah wasn't just another dot on the map. It was the place where his heart had learned to break, where he had left behind the only person who had ever made him consider parking La Milagrosa permanently. Standing beside his truck in the rest area, Ray lit a cigarette with trembling fingers and stared at the route displayed on his phone. He could call dispatch, claim mechanical problems, find an excuse to pass this load to another driver. He had done it before whenever freight threatened to take him too close to his past. But something felt different this time, as if the universe had finally tired of his elaborate detours and decided to force his hand. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings, reminding him of all the reasons he had avoided Savannah in the first place. But buried deeper, in a place he rarely allowed himself to visit, was a whisper of curiosity about what remained of the life he had abandoned. Was Elizabeth still there? Did she ever think of him during these 4 decades of silence? Had she found the happiness he had convinced himself she deserved with someone better than a restless trucker with commitment issues? Ray climbed back into his cab and sat motionless for several minutes, torn between the safety of familiar avoidance and the terrifying possibility of confronting his past. His collection of vintage radios, which he repaired during long stops, as a way to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet, seemed to mock him from their shelf behind his seat. Even broken things could be fixed, they seemed to whisper, if someone cared enough to try. The decision, when it finally came, felt like it made itself. Ray started the engine, merged back onto the interstate and pointed La Milagrosa toward Georgia. As the miles disappeared beneath his wheels, memories he had spent decades suppressing began to surface with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered the smell of jasmine in Elizabeth's hair during those perfect summer evenings in 1981. He could still hear her laugh, bright and genuine, cutting through the pretentious atmosphere of the country club where her father had tried to parade her before eligible young men from proper families. Ray had been 21 then, working construction during the day and playing guitar in bars at night to save money for his own truck. Elizabeth Walker was 19, beautiful in a way that made him forget how to breathe, and completely out of his league according to everyone who knew them both. Her father owned the largest shipping company in Savannah, while Ray could barely afford the gas money to drive his beat-up Ford to see her. But none of that had mattered during those stolen moments when it was just the two of them. Elizabeth had seen something in him that he hadn't even seen in himself, and for 6 months, Ray had believed that love might actually be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. He had been planning to propose, had even saved enough money for a modest ring when Elizabeth's father made his position crystal clear. The memory of that final conversation still had the power to make Ray's chest tighten with anger and regret. Harold Walker had been sitting behind his massive oak desk when he summoned Ray to his office, treating him like a servant rather than the man who loved his daughter. The ultimatum had been simple and brutal. Leave Savannah immediately and never contact Elizabeth again, or watch her lose her inheritance, her family, and everything she had ever known. Ray had tried to argue, had suggested they could build a life together without her father's money, but Harold Walker had laughed at his naivety. You think love pays bills, boy? You think romance puts food on the table? My Elizabeth deserves better than a life of struggle with someone who can't provide for her properly. The worst part was that deep down, Ray had believed him. He had looked at Elizabeth's manicured hands and expensive clothes, had thought about the cramped apartment he could barely afford, and had convinced himself that Harold Walker was right. Elizabeth deserved better than what he could offer, and if he truly loved her, he would want what was best for her even if it destroyed him. So he had left. Without explanation, without goodbye, without giving Elizabeth the chance to make her own choice about their future. He had simply disappeared one night, leaving behind only a hastily written note saying he had realized they were too different to make it work. He had lied to spare her the burden of choosing between him and her family, but the lie had haunted him every mile of every road he had traveled since. Now, as Savannah's city limits appeared on road signs, Ray felt his heart racing with the same mixture of anticipation and terror he had experienced as a young man in love. The Spanish moss hanging from ancient oak trees looked exactly as he remembered, and the humid air carried scents that transported him instantly back to 1981. Nothing seemed to have changed, which somehow made everything feel completely different. As La Milagrosa rumbled through the familiar streets toward the delivery address, Ray found himself scanning every face, every storefront, every corner where he and Elizabeth had once walked hand in hand. Part of him hoped to catch a glimpse of her, while another part prayed he wouldn't have to face the reality of who she might have become in his absence. Chapter 2. Walker Farm. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us from which city you're watching us. Let's continue. The GPS guided Ray through streets that felt like pages from a book he had tried to forget. Each familiar landmark stirring emotions he thought he had buried beneath decades of asphalt and diesel fumes. The delivery address led him to the outskirts of Savannah, where sprawling properties stretched between moss-draped oaks and well-maintained farmland. As La Milagrosa turned onto a gravel driveway, Ray's hands tightened on the steering wheel at the sight of wrought iron gates, bearing a name that stopped his heart cold. Walker Farm. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet there it was, carved into weathered wood and metal as if the universe had orchestrated this moment. Ray sat motionless in his truck for several minutes, engine idling, while his mind raced through possibilities. Could this still be Elizabeth's family property? Had Harold Walker kept the farm all these years, or had it changed hands? The questions multiplied faster than he could process them, each one carrying the weight of 4 decades of unresolved history. A sharp tap on his passenger window startled him from his thoughts. An elderly woman with silver hair pulled back, in a neat bun stood beside his truck, her weathered hands shading her eyes as she peered up at him. Despite the lines that age had carved around her features, something about her bearing seemed familiar, though Ray couldn't place where he might have seen her before. "You the trucker with the hydraulic parts?" she called out, her voice carrying the distinctive cadence of Georgia-born speakers. Ray nodded and climbed down from his cab, grateful for the excuse to delay whatever revelations might be waiting inside those gates. The woman's eyes studied his face with unsettling intensity as he walked around to meet her. "Well, I'll be," she murmured, more to herself than to him. 42 years and you ain't changed as much as a person might expect." Ray felt his stomach drop. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think you might have me confused with someone else. I'm just here to deliver parts." A knowing smile crossed her features. Raymond Carter used to play guitar down at Murphy's Tavern, drove that beat-up blue Ford, and had every girl in 3 counties wishing she was Elizabeth Walker. The formal introduction Ray had been preparing died in his throat. "How did you—" "I'm Margaret Cole," she said, extending a calloused hand. "I was Elizabeth's closest friend. Back then, And I work this farm now. We always wondered if you'd find your way back here eventually. The word "we" sent a jolt through Ray's system. Is she... Does Elizabeth still... Margaret's expression grew somber. Come on inside after you unload. There's sweet tea on the porch and some things you need to know. The next hour passed in a blur of mechanical routine. Ray backed his truck up to the designated warehouse, signed the delivery papers, and supervised the unloading of hydraulic equipment while his mind churned with questions and possibilities. Margaret Cole watched from the shade of a sprawling oak tree, occasionally directing the farm workers, but keeping her attention primarily focused on Ray. When the last piece of equipment had been secured in the warehouse, Margaret approached with 2 glasses of sweet tea beaded with condensation. "Walk with me," she said, gesturing toward a path that led through the property, toward what appeared to be the main house. As they walked, Margaret filled the silence with details about the farm's operations, the challenges of maintaining the property, and carefully neutral observations about the weather. But Ray could sense larger conversations hovering just beneath her words, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The main house, when it came into view, was a beautiful antebellum structure with white columns and wraparound porches that spoke of gracious living and old Southern money. Ray remembered driving past similar houses during his youth, wondering what it would be like to live in such places, while knowing they represented a world he could never enter. Harold Walker passed in 1998, Margaret said suddenly, settling into a rocking chair on the front porch and gesturing for Ray to take the seat beside her. Massive heart attack. Elizabeth inherited everything, but she never really wanted any of it. Ray sat carefully, unsure whether he wanted to hear what came next. And Elizabeth? Margaret's pause stretched long enough to make Ray's pulse quicken. Elizabeth passed 6 years ago, cancer. Fought it for 2 years before. She trailed off, studying Ray's face as the news settled over him like a weight. The sweet tea glass slipped from Ray's fingers, shattering on the porch floor in a splash of amber liquid and ice. 42 years of avoiding this conversation, of wondering what he might say if he ever saw Elizabeth again, and now he never would. The finality of it felt like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," Margaret said gently. "I know that's not what you were hoping to hear." Ray stared at his hands, trying to process the magnitude of what he had lost through his own cowardice. Was she happy? Did she have a good life? "She had her moments," Margaret replied diplomatically. "Married Thomas Beaumont in 1984. He was a good man, treated her well. They had a son." The mention of Elizabeth's son stirred something complicated in Ray's chest. Part relief that she hadn't spent her life alone, part jealousy over the family she had built with someone else, and part regret over the children they might have had together in another lifetime. "But she never forgot you," Margaret continued, her voice carrying a weight that made Ray look up sharply. "Even after Thomas passed in 2010, even during her illness, she kept your memory alive. She used to say you were the only man who ever made her feel truly free." Before Ray could respond, the sound of gravel crunching under tires announced the arrival of another vehicle. A red pickup truck pulled into the circular driveway, and a woman who appeared to be in her early 30s climbed out. Even from a distance, Ray could see something familiar in her posture, in the way she moved with quiet confidence across the yard. "That's Emily," Margaret said, rising from her chair. "Elizabeth's daughter-in-law. She's been running the farm since Elizabeth got sick." As Emily approached the porch, Ray found himself studying her features for any trace of Elizabeth. While Emily was clearly her own person, there was something in her eyes that reminded him achingly of the woman he had loved and lost so many years ago. "Emily, honey," Margaret called out, "I'd like you to meet Raymond Carter." Emily's steps faltered slightly, and Ray saw recognition flash across her face. The Raymond Carter from Elizabeth's stories. Ray stood awkwardly, unsure of the appropriate response. "I suppose that depends on what kind of stories she told." A warm smile crossed Emily's features. "All good ones, I promise. She talked about you quite a bit, especially toward the end. I think she always hoped you might come back someday." The conversation that followed revealed layers of complexity Ray hadn't anticipated. Emily had married Elizabeth's son, Nathan, in 2018, but Nathan had been taken from them tragically young in a car accident just 3 years later. Elizabeth had essentially adopted Emily as the daughter she never had, and Emily had remained on the farm out of love and loyalty rather than legal obligation. "There's something else," Emily said, as the afternoon light began to fade. "Something Elizabeth made me promise to show you if you ever returned." She disappeared into the house and returned carrying a weathered wooden box that she placed carefully in Ray's hands. His fingers trembled as he lifted the lid to reveal dozens of letters, all addressed to him in Elizabeth's elegant handwriting, none of them ever sent. "She wrote to you for years," Emily explained softly, "especially after her father passed away. She always wondered what might have happened if she had been brave enough to find you." Ray picked up the letter on top, dated just 3 months before Elizabeth's passing, and felt his vision blur as he read the opening lines. "My dearest Ray, I dreamed about you again last night, and I woke up wondering if you ever think of that summer when we believed love could conquer everything." Chapter 3. Letters Never Sent. The weight of the wooden box in Ray's hands felt heavier than any cargo he had ever hauled across the country. As twilight settled over Walker Farm, Emily and Margaret retreated into the house to give him privacy, leaving him alone on the porch with 4 decades of Elizabeth's unspoken words. The first letter, dated 1985, began with the careful formality of someone unsure whether her words would ever reach their intended recipient. "Dear Raymond," it read, "I don't know if this address will find you, but Margaret helped me track down your trucking company. I wanted you to know that I never understood why you left so suddenly. Was it something I said? Something I didn't say? The not knowing is harder than the goodbye itself." Ray's hands shook as he continued reading. Elizabeth had discovered his father's address through old phone records and had written to him there, hoping the letters might be forwarded. She told him about her wedding to Thomas Beaumont, describing it not as a celebration, but as a decision made to please her father and fill the emptiness Ray had left behind. "Thomas is a good man," she had written, "but he's not you. He doesn't make me laugh until my sides ache, and he's never played guitar under my window at midnight. I keep telling myself that mature love is different from young love, but I wonder if I'm just settling for safe, when what I really want is the wild freedom I felt when we were together." Each letter revealed another layer of the life Elizabeth had built in Ray's absence. She wrote about her pregnancy with Nathan, her joy at becoming a mother, and her struggles with postpartum depression that she couldn't explain to anyone, because how could she tell them she was mourning a love that had ended before it really began? "Nathan has your eyes," she wrote when her son was 2 years old. "It's ridiculous, I know, because he's not yours, but there's something in the way he looks at the world that reminds me of how you used to see possibilities everywhere. I catch myself wondering what our children might have looked like, and then I feel guilty for thinking such things when I have a beautiful family right in front of me." The letters from the 1990s carried a different tone, more settled, but tinged with quiet resignation. Elizabeth wrote about Nathan's childhood achievements, Thomas's promotion to partner at his law firm, and the social obligations that filled her days but left her feeling empty. She described elaborate charity galas and country club events as performances where I play the role of the perfect wife while my real self watches from somewhere far away. Ray found himself completely absorbed in Elizabeth's inner world, seeing his own choices reflected through her eyes. In a letter from 1997, she wrote about driving past Murphy's Tavern, which had been converted into a coffee shop, and remembering the night he had played Sweet Caroline just for her while drunk college students sang along. "I sat in my car in that parking lot for 20 minutes today," the letter continued, "crying for no reason I could explain to myself. Or maybe crying for every reason I've been too afraid to acknowledge. I keep wondering if you remember that night, if you remember any of it, or if what felt like the most important chapter of my life was just a brief story in yours." The correspondence revealed that Elizabeth had hired a private investigator in 1998, shortly after her father's passing, to try to locate Ray. The investigator had tracked him to several trucking companies, but could never pin down his current location due to his transient lifestyle. Elizabeth had written a letter to each address, never knowing that none of them had reached him. "I know it's foolish to keep writing to you when I don't even know if you're alive," she had written in 2003. "But these letters have become my confession. Booth, the place where I can be honest about the parts of my heart that never moved on. Thomas thinks I'm writing in a journal, and I suppose in a way I am. A journal addressed to the one person who might understand the woman I was before I became who everyone expected me to be." The letters from after Thomas's passing in 2010 carried a different energy entirely. Widowed at 58, Elizabeth wrote with new honesty about the choices she had made and the regrets she carried. "I loved Thomas," she wrote 6 months after his funeral, "but I was never in love with him the way I was with you. He deserved better than that, and so did I. But I was so afraid of disappointing people, so afraid of being seen as irresponsible or impulsive, that I chose the safe path and spent 40 years wondering what would have happened if I'd been braver." As Ray read deeper into the collection, he discovered that Elizabeth had suffered a mild heart attack in 2012 that served as a wake-up call about mortality and unfinished business. Her letters from that period were filled with determination to live more authentically, to stop caring so much about other people's expectations, and to find closure with the past that had haunted her for so long. "I've started driving the back roads on weekends," she wrote. "Not going anywhere in particular, just feeling the freedom I used to feel when I was 19 and thought the whole world was possible. I roll the windows down and play music loud enough to annoy the neighbors, and for a few hours I remember who I was before I became who I thought I should be." Emily appeared at the screen door as Ray finished reading a letter from 2014, describing Elizabeth's decision to sell the shipping company and convert Walker Farm into a working agricultural operation that employed local families. "She changed a lot after Thomas passed," Emily said softly, stepping back onto the porch. "Became more herself, if that makes sense. Less concerned with appearances and more focused on what actually mattered to her." Ray looked up from the letters, his eyes red from reading by porchlight. "She hired a private investigator to find me. 3 different ones over the years," Emily confirmed. "The last one was in 2018, right before Nathan and I got married. She said she wanted to invite you to the wedding, wanted you to meet the family she had built. When the investigator couldn't locate you, she wrote one final letter." Emily reached into the box and pulled out an envelope marked, "For Raymond, if he ever comes home." The paper was newer than the others, and Ray could see that it had been handled frequently, as if Elizabeth had picked it up many times, but never been able to bring herself to send it. "She made me promise to give this to you personally," Emily said. "Said it was the most important thing she had ever written, and it deserved to be delivered by hand." Ray's fingers trembled as he opened the envelope. The letter inside was longer than the others, written in Elizabeth's familiar script, but with the shakiness that comes with age and illness. "My dearest Ray," it began, "if you are reading this, then fate has finally brought you back to Savannah. And I hope that means you're ready to hear what I should have said 42 years ago. I should have fought for us. I should have chosen love over comfort, adventure over security, you over everything else that seemed important at the time but turned out to be just noise." The letter continued for 3 pages, filled with Elizabeth's regrets, her gratitude for the time they had shared, and her hopes that Ray had found happiness somewhere on the endless roads he traveled. But the final paragraph contained a revelation that made Ray's hands shake so violently he nearly dropped the paper. "There's something I never told you, something I should have said before you left but was too afraid to share. I was pregnant, Ray. For 6 weeks after you disappeared, I carried our child, and I spent every day hoping you would come back so we could figure it out together. I lost the baby in my 3rd month, and I've wondered every day since then if the heartbreak and stress contributed to the miscarriage. Our child existed, briefly but completely, and you deserve to know." Chapter 4. The Weight of Truth. The letter slipped from Ray's fingers and fluttered to the porch floor like a wounded bird. The words echoed in his mind with devastating clarity. Pregnant, lost the baby, heartbreak, and stress. For 42 years, he had carried the guilt of abandoning Elizabeth, but now he understood that his cowardice had cost them both far more than he had ever imagined. Emily knelt beside his chair and gently retrieved the letter, her eyes scanning the final paragraph with the familiarity of someone who had read it many times before. "She told me about the pregnancy," she said softly. "It was one of the last conversations we had before she passed. She said carrying that secret for so long had been almost unbearable." Ray's vision blurred as waves of grief and regret crashed over him. "I didn't know. If I had known..." His voice broke, unable to complete the thought. What would he have done differently? Would he have stayed and fought Harold Walker? Would he have found the courage to choose love over the security he thought Elizabeth deserved? "She didn't blame you," Emily continued, settling into the chair beside him. "She blamed herself for not being brave enough to tell you before you left. She said she spent weeks trying to find the right moment, the right words, but she was terrified of how you might react." The porch fell silent except for the rhythmic creaking of the old wooden planks and the distant sound of crickets beginning their evening chorus. Ray stared out at the darkening fields, trying to process the magnitude of what he had learned. Somewhere in his mind, a child that had never been born took shape, a ghost of possibility that would now haunt him alongside all his other regrets. "Why didn't she try harder to find me after her father passed?" Ray asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "If she hired investigators, if she wrote all those letters, why didn't she just track down my trucking company directly?" Emily exchanged a meaningful glance with Margaret, who had quietly returned to the porch during their conversation. "Because she was afraid," Margaret said, settling into her own chair. "Afraid that you had moved on completely, maybe found someone else, built a life that didn't include room for ghosts from the past. She said she'd rather live with the fantasy that you might still love her than face the reality that you had forgotten her entirely." Ray laughed bitterly. "Forgotten her? I've spent 4 decades avoiding this city because I couldn't bear the thought of seeing her happy with someone else. Every woman I've ever met since then has been compared to a 19-year-old girl who made me believe in forever." She would have been relieved to hear that, Emily said with a sad smile. She used to wonder if she had imagined how strong the connection was between you two, if maybe she had built it up in her memory to be more than it really was. Margaret reached into her handbag and pulled out a small leather-bound photo album. "She kept this in her bedside table," she said, handing it to Ray. "Pictures of you two together, mostly taken without your knowledge by friends who thought you made a beautiful couple." Ray opened the album with trembling hands and was transported instantly back to the summer of 1981. There they were at a beach bonfire, Elizabeth's head on his shoulder as he played guitar for their friends. Another photo showed them dancing at Margaret's wedding, lost in each other's eyes, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. In every image, their happiness was radiant and uncomplicated, the kind of joy that comes only once in a lifetime. She looked at these pictures every night during her illness, Emily said quietly. She said they reminded her that she had experienced true love, even if it was only for a brief time. She felt grateful for that summer, rather than bitter about how it ended. Ray turned the page and found a photo he didn't remember being taken. He was sitting on the tailgate of his old Ford truck, tuning his guitar, while Elizabeth sat in the truck bed behind him, her arms wrapped around his shoulders and her chin resting on his head. The camera had captured a moment of perfect intimacy, the kind of casual affection that develops between two people who have become essential to each other's happiness. "I remember this day," Ray said, his voice thick with emotion. "We had driven out to the old cotton fields to watch the sunset. Elizabeth said she wanted to memorize the way the light looked on my face because she knew summer wouldn't last forever." "She was right about that," Margaret observed gently. "But maybe she was wrong about some other things. Maybe it's not too late for some kinds of healing." Before Ray could ask what she meant, Emily stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the farm that Elizabeth had transformed in her final years. "There's something else you need to know," she said, her back still turned to them. "About Nathan, Elizabeth's son." Ray looked up from the photo album, sensing another revelation. approaching. What about him? Emily turned to face him, her expression serious but not unkind. His middle name was Raymond. Elizabeth named him Nathan Raymond Beaumont, and when Thomas asked why, she told him it was after her grandfather. But she told me the truth years later. She named him for you. The weight of that information settled over Ray like a physical presence. Elizabeth had carried his name into her marriage, had given it to the son she raised with another man, had found a way to keep a piece of their love alive even as she built a life with someone else. Nathan knew about you, Emily continued. Not at first, but Elizabeth told him the story when he turned 18. She said she wanted him to understand that sometimes the greatest loves are the ones that don't work out, and that doesn't make them less important or less real. Ray closed the photo album and set it carefully on the table beside him. What? Did he think about that? He was curious, Emily said, returning to her chair. He used to joke that he wanted to meet the legendary Raymond Carter, who had stolen his mother's heart and then disappeared into the sunset like some kind of romantic cowboy. He said you sounded like a character from one of those country songs his mother used to play when she thought no one was listening. The mention of Nathan's curiosity stirred something in Ray's chest that might have been hope or might have been regret. Did Nathan ever try to find me? Emily smiled for the first time since their conversation had begun. Actually, yes. In 2019, about a year after we got married, he hired his own private investigator. He said he wanted to invite you to our wedding, wanted Elizabeth to have the chance to see you again before... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The investigator found you, Margaret said quietly, got as far as a truck stop in Montana where you had been 3 days earlier. But by the time Nathan got there, you had already moved on. Ray felt his chest tighten. He came looking for me. Elizabeth's son actually came looking for me. He rented a car and drove 1,200 miles, Emily confirmed. Spent a week following your route, always just missing you. He said it was like chasing a ghost, but he was determined to try. He called Elizabeth every night to update her on his progress, and she was more hopeful during that week than I had seen her since her diagnosis. What happened? Why did he give up? Emily's expression grew somber. He didn't give up. He was planning to try again, maybe hire a better investigator or wait at one of the truck stops where you were known to return regularly. But then, she paused, collecting herself. Nathan was taken from us in March of 2020. A drunk driver ran a red light. The finality of that statement hit Ray like a physical blow. Not only had he missed the chance to meet Elizabeth again, but he had also lost the opportunity to know the young man who had carried his name and inherited his curiosity about the road not taken. Elizabeth was devastated, Margaret said. Losing Nathan broke something in her that never quite healed. She said it felt like losing you all over again, except this time there was no possibility of a different ending. Ray sat in stunned silence, trying to process the complexity of connections he had never known existed. Nathan Raymond Beaumont had been more than just Elizabeth's son. He had been a bridge between their past and a future that might have been possible. A young man curious enough about his mother's first love to cross the country in search of answers. She wrote you one more letter after Nathan passed, Emily said softly, but she never finished it. I found it on her desk after she died, just a few lines about how losing him had made her understand how you must have felt when you thought you had to choose between love and responsibility. As the evening deepened around them, Ray felt the weight of all these revelations settling into his bones. The story he had told himself for 42 years, that he had made a noble sacrifice by leaving Elizabeth to find a better life, was crumbling under the weight of evidence that his absence had caused more pain than his presence ever could have. Chapter 5. Hidden Treasures. The night air had grown cool by the time Emily suggested they move inside, but Ray found himself reluctant to leave the porch where so many truths had been revealed. The wooden box of letters sat in his lap like a treasure chest that had taken 42 years to unlock, and he wasn't ready to close it again. However, Emily's gentle insistence that there was more to show him finally convinced him to follow her into the house. The interior of the Walker farmhouse was both exactly as Ray remembered and completely transformed. The formal, intimidating atmosphere that Harold Walker had cultivated was gone, replaced by warm, lived-in comfort that spoke of a home rather than a showcase. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, and Ray found himself studying images of Elizabeth at various stages of her life, watching her age gracefully through the decades he had missed. She redecorated everything after her father passed, Margaret explained, noticing his attention to the changes. Said she wanted the house to feel like a home instead of a museum. She kept some of the antiques that had real sentimental value, but she got rid of all the pretentious stuff that was just for show. Emily led them to what had once been Harold Walker's imposing office, now converted into a cozy library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a comfortable reading nook by the window. Elizabeth spent most of her time here during her final months, Emily said. She said it was poetic justice to fill her father's old office with the things that actually mattered to her. Ray approached one of the bookshelves and was surprised to see an entire section dedicated to travel guides and road atlases. Dozens of books about cross-country trucking, highway history, and American road culture filled 2 full shelves, all showing signs of being frequently read. She became fascinated with your world, Emily explained. After Nathan started looking for you, she wanted to understand the life you had chosen. She read everything she could find about long-haul trucking, studied maps of interstate highways, even learned about the different types of cargo and delivery schedules. Margaret chuckled softly. She could tell you the best truck stops in every state and the most efficient routes between major cities. Became something of an expert on the subject, though she never explained to most people why she was so interested in trucking logistics. Ray ran his fingers along the spine of a well-worn book titled The American Trucker, Masters of the Open Road. The pages fell open to a section about CB radio culture, filled with handwritten notes in Elizabeth's careful script. She had annotated the margins with questions and observations, as if trying to decode the language of a world she had never experienced. She bought a CB radio in 2018, Emily said, moving to a corner of the room where an old radio setup sat, on a small desk. Spent hours listening to trucker conversations, hoping she might hear your voice. She learned all the call signs and route numbers, memorized the codes drivers used to communicate with each other. The radio was an expensive model, far more sophisticated than the simple units Ray had seen in most truck cabs. Elizabeth had clearly invested both money and time in understanding this aspect of his life, as if mastering the technical details might somehow bring her closer to him. Did she ever try to reach out on the radio? Ray asked, settling into the chair beside the desk. A few times, Margaret replied, but she was too nervous to actually transmit. She would compose messages to you, practice what she wanted to say, but she could never bring herself to put her voice out there where thousands of strangers might hear it. Emily opened a desk drawer and pulled out a notebook filled with Elizabeth's handwriting. She wrote down everything she wanted to tell you over the CB radio. Look at this. Ray opened the notebook to find pages of drafted messages, all addressed to Milagrosa in Elizabeth's elegant script. Milagrosa. This is someone from your past hoping you might remember a summer in Savannah when the jasmine was in bloom and 2 young people thought they could change the world with love alone. Another entry read, looking for Raymond Carter, driver of La Milagrosa. This is Elizabeth Walker, now Elizabeth Beaumont, calling from Georgia to say that you were right to leave, but you were wrong to think I would be better off without you. The messages revealed Elizabeth's evolution from uncertainty to clarity about their past relationship. Later entries showed more confidence. Ray, if you can hear this, I want you to know that loving you was the best decision I ever made, and losing you was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But I understand why you left, and I forgive you for everything, except not giving me the chance to choose. She planned to actually transmit one of these messages on your birthday, Emily said. July 15th. She had it all worked out, knew which channels were most likely to reach long-haul drivers, had researched the best times of day for long-distance communication. Ray looked up sharply. How did she know when my birthday was? She remembered everything about you, Margaret said with a gentle smile. Your birthday, your favorite foods, the songs you used to play, the way you took your coffee. She said that when you really love someone, those details get burned into your memory forever. Emily moved to another section of the room and opened a cedar chest that Ray hadn't noticed before. But the radio messages weren't the only way she tried to reach you. She pulled out a thick manila folder and handed it to Ray. She placed advertisements in trucking magazines and newspapers across the country. Ray opened the folder to find dozens of printed advertisements, all following a similar format. Seeking Raymond Carter, long-haul trucker, last known to drive La Milagrosa. Personal matter of great importance. Contact Elizabeth Beaumont, Savannah, Georgia. The ads included phone numbers, email addresses, and even a post office box number. She ran these ads for 15 years, Emily said, in every trucking publication she could find, in newspapers in cities where the investigators thought you might have been. She probably spent $20,000 trying to reach you. Margaret pointed to one particularly large advertisement that had run in a national trucking magazine. This one included a photograph of you two together from 1981. She thought maybe someone would recognize you and pass along the message. Ray studied the advertisement, seeing his own young face, staring back at him from beside Elizabeth's radiant smile. The caption read, "If you know this man or have any information about Raymond Carter, please contact Elizabeth Beaumont. A love story needs an ending." Did anyone ever respond? Ray asked, though he already suspected the answer. A few false leads, Emily replied. People who claimed to know drivers named Ray or Raymond, but they never panned out. She investigated every single response personally, drove hundreds of miles to meet people who turned out to be mistaken or hoping for some kind of reward. The folder contained correspondence with dozens of trucking companies, letters to union representatives, and even appeals to CB radio clubs asking for help in locating one of their own. Elizabeth had been methodical and thorough, leaving no stone unturned in her quest to reconnect with the man who had shaped her understanding of love. The last advertisement ran just 6 months before she passed, Margaret said quietly. Even when she was fighting cancer, she kept hoping you might see it and come home. Ray closed the folder and sat back in the chair, overwhelmed by the evidence of Elizabeth's devotion. For 4 decades, while he had been running from their memory, she had been actively trying to bridge the gap he had created. Every mile he had driven to avoid confronting their past, she had been working to close the distance between them. "There's one more thing," Emily said, her voice carrying a note of anticipation. "Something she made me promise to show you only if you seemed ready to hear it." She moved to a tall cabinet in the corner of the room and retrieved what appeared to be an old cassette tape player. The device was vintage but well maintained, and when Emily pressed play, the room filled with the sound of Elizabeth's voice, older than Ray remembered, but unmistakably hers. "My dearest Ray," the recorded voice began, "if you are hearing this, then Emily has judged that you are ready for the truth I was never brave enough to tell you while I was alive. I made this recording in January when the doctors told me I had maybe 6 months left, because I wanted you to hear these words in my own voice." Ray's hands gripped the arms of his chair as Elizabeth's voice continued, clear and strong, despite her illness. "I need you to know that every decision I made after you left was colored by the hope that someday you might come back. I married Thomas because I thought it was what I was supposed to do, but I never stopped being in love with you. I named our son Nathan Raymond because I wanted to carry a piece of you with me always. And when he grew up and wanted to find you, I knew he had inherited your restless spirit." The recording paused, and Ray could hear Elizabeth taking a shaky breath before continuing. "But most importantly, I need you to know that I understand why you left. I understand that my father made you feel like you weren't good enough for me, and I understand that you thought you were protecting me from a difficult life. You were wrong, but I understand. What I can't forgive myself for is not fighting harder to keep you, not being brave enough to tell you that I would rather have struggled with you than lived comfortably without you." Emily watched Ray's face as the tape continued, seeing tears track down his weathered cheeks as Elizabeth's voice filled the room with 42 years of unspoken love and regret. Chapter 6. The Final Revelation. Elizabeth's recorded voice continued to fill the room, each word carrying the weight of a lifetime of unresolved emotions. Ray sat motionless, afraid that any movement might break the spell that was allowing him to hear her speak to him across the void of her passing. "The hardest part about loving you, Ray, wasn't losing you," Elizabeth's voice said through the speakers. "It was spending 40 years wondering if what we had was real or if I had imagined the depth of our connection. Did you feel the same way I felt? Did those 6 months change your life the way they changed mine? Or was I just a summer romance for a young man who was always going to choose the road over any woman?" Ray found himself answering aloud, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "It was real," he whispered. "It was the most real thing that ever happened to me." Emily paused the tape and looked at him with understanding eyes. "She knew you would say that. She recorded this next part specifically for that moment." When the tape resumed, Elizabeth's voice seemed to address his unspoken response directly. "I hope you're saying it was real because I need you to understand something important. Every mile you've driven since you left Savannah, you've been carrying me with you whether you knew it or not. Just like I've been carrying you through every day of marriage, motherhood, and the life I built after you were gone." The recording paused again, and they could hear papers shuffling as Elizabeth apparently consulted notes she had prepared. "Emily is going to show you something now that I've kept hidden for 42 years. It's the real reason my father was so determined to drive you away, and it's the truth that might have changed everything if I had been brave enough to tell you at the time." Emily moved to a wall safe that Ray hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a landscape painting of the Georgia coast. She entered a combination and withdrew a thick legal envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax that bore the Walker family crest. "Elizabeth made me promise to wait until after you heard her voice before showing you this," Emily said, handing him the envelope. She said the context was important. Ray's hands trembled as he broke the ancient wax seal and withdrew a collection of official-looking documents. The first was a letter dated August 15, 1981, written in Harold Walker's distinctive handwriting. On his company letterhead. "Mr. Carter," the letter began, "by the time you read this, my daughter will have told you about her pregnancy, and you will be facing the most important decision of your young life. I am writing to offer you an alternative to the poverty and struggle that would await you both if you choose to marry." Ray's vision blurred as he continued reading. Harold Walker had known about Elizabeth's pregnancy before Ray had ever learned of it. The letter outlined a detailed proposal. Ray would leave Savannah immediately and never contact Elizabeth again, and in exchange, Harold would establish a trust fund of $50,000 in Ray's name, accessible after Elizabeth's child was safely born and adopted by a suitable family. "Your sacrifice," Harold had written, "will ensure that my daughter can continue her education and marry into the social circle where she belongs, while your child will be raised by a family with the means to provide proper opportunities. This is a chance for you to do the right thing for everyone involved, including yourself." The letter concluded with a threat thinly disguised as concern. "If you choose to stay and force my daughter into a hasty marriage, I will ensure that no trucking company in the Southeast will hire you, and no bank will extend credit for the truck you dream of purchasing. You will condemn Elizabeth to a life of poverty while destroying your own dreams of independence." Ray looked up at Emily, his face pale with shock. "He knew she was pregnant? He knew before I left?" "Keep reading," Emily said gently. "There's more." The next document was a bank statement showing that Harold Walker had indeed established the trust fund, depositing $50,000 3 days after Ray's departure from Savannah. The account had remained untouched for 6 months before Harold withdrew the money and closed the account, apparently after Elizabeth's miscarriage eliminated his need to finance an adoption. But it was the final document that delivered the revelation. That would shatter everything Ray thought he knew about his past. It was a medical report from Savannah General Hospital, dated October 12, 1981, confirming the birth of a healthy baby boy to Elizabeth Walker. The report was signed by Dr. Margaret Thornton and countersigned by a hospital administrator. Ray read the document 3 times before its implications fully registered. "She didn't lose the baby," he said, his voice barely audible. "Elizabeth didn't have a miscarriage." Emily's recorded voice resumed from the tape player as if Elizabeth had anticipated his shock. "I lied about the miscarriage, Ray. I'm sorry. But I lied about something so important that it's haunted me every day since. Our son was born healthy and beautiful on October 12, 1981. I named him David Raymond Walker, and I kept him for exactly 18 hours before my father forced me to give him up for adoption." The room seemed to spin around Ray as Elizabeth's voice continued the most devastating revelation of his life. "My father had already arranged everything with a family in Atlanta. They were wealthy, educated, unable to have children of their own. He convinced me that keeping David would ruin his chances for a good life, that a teenage mother with no husband and no money could never provide what he needed." Ray's hands shook as he tried to process the magnitude of what he was learning. Not only had he had a son with Elizabeth, but that son had been alive somewhere in the world for the past 42 years, growing up with another family while Ray remained completely unaware of his existence. "I told you I lost the baby, because I couldn't bear to tell you the truth," Elizabeth's voice continued through tears that were audible even on the old recording. "How could I explain that I had given away our child? How could I admit that I was too weak to fight my father, too scared to trust that we could have made it work together?" Emily stopped the tape and sat down across from Ray, giving him time to absorb the shocking news. "She spent the rest of her life regretting that decision," Emily said softly. "She hired investigators not just to find you, but to find David as well. She wanted to reunite all three of you, to try to heal the damage her father had caused." Ray stared at the birth certificate in his hands, reading his son's name over and over, David Raymond Walker. "Did she find him? Does he know about us?" "She found him," Emily confirmed. "In 2015, she finally located him through one of the private investigators. His adoptive parents named him David Mitchell, and he became a successful architect in Atlanta. He's married, has 2 children of his own." The tape resumed with Elizabeth's voice, now steadier as she moved toward the conclusion of her message. "David knows about you, Ray. I contacted him 3 years ago and told him the whole story. He was angry at first, confused about why he had been given up for adoption when he had 2 parents who could have raised him. But eventually he understood that we were all victims of my father's manipulation." Ray felt his chest tighten with a mixture of hope and terror. "Does he want to meet me?" Emily reached into the envelope and pulled out a photograph that made Ray's breath catch in his throat. It showed a man in his early 40s with familiar eyes and a confident smile, standing beside a woman and 2 children in what appeared to be a family portrait. "That's David with his wife Sarah and their children. Emily and Raymond," Emily said, pointing to each person in the photograph. "He named his son after you, Ray. He's been hoping you would come back to Georgia so he could meet his biological father." Elizabeth's voice delivered the final portion of her message. "David lives at 847 Peachtree Circle in Atlanta, and his phone number is written on the back of his photograph. He knows you might contact him someday, and he's prepared for that conversation. He wants to know you, Ray. He wants to understand where he came from and what kind of man his father really is." The recording concluded with Elizabeth's voice, soft and full of love. "I know this is overwhelming, and I know you probably need time to process everything you've learned, but please don't let fear keep you from reaching out to David the way it kept you from coming back to me. Don't let another 40 years pass while you convince yourself that he's better off without you. He's not. He needs his father, and you need your son." As the tape clicked off, Ray sat in stunned silence, surrounded by the evidence of a life he had never known existed. He had a son, a 42-year-old son who was an architect in Atlanta, who had children of his own, who had been waiting for years to meet the father he had never known. Emily watched his face carefully as she delivered the final piece of information. "David knows you're in Savannah, Ray. I called him this afternoon when I realized who you were. He's driving down from Atlanta tomorrow morning, hoping you'll be ready to meet him." Ray looked up sharply. "Tomorrow? He's coming here tomorrow?" "Only if you want to see him," Emily said quickly. "I told him you needed time to process everything first, but he's been waiting 42 years to meet you, Ray. He doesn't want to wait any longer if he doesn't have to." The weight of 42 years of missed opportunities settled over Ray like a heavy blanket. He had spent his entire adult life believing he had made a noble sacrifice by walking away from Elizabeth, only to discover that his absence had caused immeasurable pain to everyone involved. But now, impossibly, he was being offered a chance at redemption. Chapter 7. Coming Home. The morning sun cast golden rays across Walker Farm as Ray stood on the front porch, clutching a cup of coffee that had grown cold in his trembling hands. He had spent the night in the guest room that Emily had prepared for him, but sleep had been impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the photograph of David Mitchell, his son, and tried to imagine what their first conversation might be like. Emily emerged from the house carrying a fresh pot of coffee and settled into the chair beside him. "He called an hour ago," she said gently. "David's about 30 minutes away. He wanted to make sure you hadn't changed your mind." Ray nodded, unable to trust his voice. In all his years of imagining different scenarios for his life, he had never envisioned this moment. How do you meet a son you never knew existed? What do you say to a man who has spent 4 decades wondering about his biological father? "What if he hates me?" Ray asked suddenly, voicing the fear that had kept him awake all night. "What if he blames me for not being there, for not fighting harder to stay with Elizabeth?" Emily set down her coffee cup and turned to face him fully. "David doesn't hate you, Ray. He's angry about the situation, about the choices that were made for all of you, but he doesn't blame you. Elizabeth made sure he understood that you never knew about him." Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression gentle but serious. "I've known David since Elizabeth found him 7 years ago," she said. "He's a good man, Ray. He inherited Elizabeth's kindness and your stubborn determination. He's not coming here to judge you. He's coming to finally meet his father." The sound of tires on gravel announced David's arrival before Ray was ready. A silver sedan pulled into the circular driveway, and Ray watched through the porch railings as a tall man with familiar eyes emerged from the driver's seat. Even from a distance, the resemblance was unmistakable. David had Ray's build and Elizabeth's graceful movements, and when he looked up at the porch, his smile was a perfect blend of both his parents. "Take your time," Emily whispered as David approached the front steps. "There's no rush and there's no wrong way to do this." David climbed the porch steps slowly, his eyes never leaving Ray's face. When he reached the top, father and son stood facing each other for the first time in 42 years, separated by just a few feet, but connected by bonds neither had fully understood until now. "You're taller than I expected," David said finally, his voice carrying just a hint of nervous laughter. "Elizabeth always described you as larger than life, but I thought that might have been romantic nostalgia." Ray found himself smiling despite his nervousness. "And you look exactly like your mother when she was your age, except for the eyes. Those are definitely mine." The ice broken, David extended his hand, but Ray surprised them both by pulling his son into a fierce embrace instead. 42 years. They have missed hugs, missed birthdays, missed conversations poured out in that moment, and neither man tried to hide the tears that came with finally finding each other. "I'm sorry," Ray whispered against David's shoulder. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there." "For you. You didn't know," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We all did the best we could with the information we had. The important thing is that we're here now." They spent the morning on the porch, sharing stories and filling in the gaps that 4 decades had created. David told Ray about his childhood, with loving adoptive parents who had always been honest about his adoption, about his education and career as an architect, about meeting his wife Sarah, and the joy of becoming a father himself. "I always wondered about you," David said, pulling out his phone to show Ray pictures of his grandchildren. "Mom and Dad Mitchell were wonderful, but there was always this sense that part of my story was missing. When Elizabeth contacted me in 2015, it was like finding a piece of a puzzle I didn't even know I was working on." Ray studied the photos of 8-year-old Emily and 5-year-old Raymond, his grandchildren who shared his name and his genes, but had grown up in a world he had never known. "They're beautiful," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Do they know about me?" "They know. They have a grandfather who drives trucks all over the country," David replied with a smile. "Emily has been fascinated by the idea of someone whose office is the highway. She wants to ride in a big truck someday and see the world from behind the wheel." The afternoon brought Sarah and the children, who had driven down from Atlanta, to meet their newly discovered grandfather. Little Emily was indeed fascinated by La Milagrosa, asking detailed questions about the CB radio, the sleeping compartment, and how many states Ray had visited. 5-year-old Raymond was shyer but warmed up quickly when Ray showed him the collection of vintage radios he repaired during his stops. "Can you fix this one, Grandpa Ray?" Raymond asked, holding up a small transistor radio that had belonged to Elizabeth. "Emily said it used to play music, but it's been quiet for a long time." Ray took the radio carefully, recognizing it as one of Elizabeth's favorites from their summer together in 1981. As he examined the internal components, he found a small piece of paper tucked behind the battery compartment, a note in Elizabeth's handwriting that simply said, "Some broken things can be fixed if someone cares enough to try." Working together with his grandson, Ray replaced a few corroded connections and adjusted the antenna. When he switched the radio on, it crackled to life with a clear, strong signal, playing an old country song that made the adults on the porch smile with recognition. "Your grandmother loved this song," Ray told Raymond, who clapped his hands in delight at having helped bring the radio back to life. "She used to say it reminded her that some of the best things in life are worth waiting for." As the day progressed, Ray found himself relaxing into the role of father and grandfather with surprising ease. The conversations flowed naturally, and the awkwardness he had feared never materialized. David was genuinely interested in Ray's life as a trucker, asking thoughtful questions about the places he had seen and the freedom of the open road. "I understand why you chose that life," David said as they watched the children play in the farmyard. "There's something appealing about being able to pick up and go wherever the road takes you, but I'm glad you're here now." Emily joined them as the sun began to set, bringing out a bottle of wine and glasses for the adults. "Elizabeth would have loved this," she said, raising her glass in a toast. "All of you together, finally where you belong." As the evening drew to a close, David made a proposal that surprised everyone. "I know you probably need to get back on the road soon," he said to Ray. "But Sarah and I were wondering if you might consider staying in Georgia for a while. We have a guest house in Atlanta, and the kids would love to spend more time with their grandfather." Ray felt his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "I've been running for 42 years, he said quietly. "Maybe it's time I stopped." "What about La Milagrosa?" Emily asked. "What about your life on the road?" Ray looked at his truck, faithful companion of so many years, then back at his family gathered around him. "I think La Milagrosa has brought me exactly where I needed to be. Maybe it's time for both of us to rest." David pulled out his phone and showed Ray photos of a workshop space behind his house. "I could use help designing a restoration garage for classic cars," he said. "Turns out there's a market for architects who understand both form and function. Interested in a partnership?" 6 months later, Ray Carter could be found most mornings in the workshop behind David's house, teaching his grandson Raymond how to repair vintage radios while helping his son design renovation projects for classic vehicles. La Milagrosa sat in the driveway, converted into a unique office space where 3 generations of the Carter-Mitchell family gathered to work on projects that combined David's architectural expertise with Ray's mechanical knowledge. Emily visited every few weeks, bringing updates from Walker Farm and stories about the community that Elizabeth had built there. The farm had become a cooperative operation that provided employment for dozens of local families, exactly as Elizabeth had envisioned in her final years. On quiet evenings, Ray would sit on David's back porch, listening to his grandchildren, practice the guitar he had taught them to play, and he would think about Elizabeth. He had finally come home, not to a place but to the family that had been waiting for him all along. The road that had defined his life for so many years had led him exactly where he needed to be. The last letter in Elizabeth's collection, the one she had never finished, had ended with the words, "Love doesn't end when someone leaves. It just waits patiently for them to find their way back home. Ray had finally understood what she meant. Fim da Historia. Dear viewers, we hope Ray and Elizabeth's story has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. Love, they say, never truly dies. It simply waits for the right moment to find its way back home. If this story moved you, we invite you to explore our special playlist of equally captivating stories by clicking to your left. These tales explore the beautiful complexity of human relationships and the power of second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up if Ray's journey resonated with you. Every day, we bring you unique stories that celebrate the resilience of the human heart and the magic that happens when we finally stop running from our past. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your own experiences with love, loss, and the unexpected roads that lead us home. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to find your way back to what truly matters.